Okay, so one of the things I am most excited to get started with in the spring is the agroforest. So what is an agroforest? There's lots of labels to this kind of thing and this kind of world, like your permaculture, food forest, agroforest, forest gardening, all that good stuff. And it's all quite a similar concept, which is basically growing trees and agricultural crops in the same place in some kind of mutually beneficial way. A lot of the differences are sort of down to the exact way of doing it and sort of how they're measured. But obviously a lot of that is referring to sort of how commercially viable these things are on like a bigger scale, which obviously in this case, this isn't a commercial farm that I'm building. It is just the two of us. So I'm going to sort of try and steer away from those kind of labels and not necessarily stick to one lane with that sort of thing. I'm just going to look at all the different sort of schools of thought and take the bits that work best for me here on this piece of land. So the area that I've got set aside for the agroforest is probably about an acre, which I think should be a really good mat space to get started with. That's still going to take a lot of filling, but there's a lot of fruit trees and things like that I really would like to get in there. So I need a fair amount of space around them, obviously, for a good few years. My trees are going to be little twigs, but I know that those things are going to take the longest to get established, so that's where I'm going to start. Then I'm going to sort of build in the layers of a forest around those things. So even though I won't be getting a yield from my fruit trees in the near future, they are going to be the biggest, tallest thing that's going to sort of be shading out everything else. So I need to think about where they're going to go first and then sort of build the areas around them with things that will sort of be mutually beneficial. Okay, so the general idea of sort of having an agroforest here rather than just like a traditional orchard is basically taking the sort of natural interactions between plants that would be here in sort of natural forest for this climate, and recognising the sort of interactions between those plants and using those things to benefit us in our harvest. It's the idea being that you sort of walk around a forest and you can see all the different layers. You've got your big trees, your big sort of canopy layer that's in the top creating all the shade, and you've got all sorts of things climbing up them, you've got all shrubs underneath them, you've got ground cover, and then you've just got all the sort of layers and layers of organic matter from the trees falling down the whole time. That kind of idea is what we're trying to replicate, but using plants that are either going to give us something that we want or are going to work together to increase the yield of the things that we want. This project is big, and it is much too big for my fairly average sized brain to plan all in one go, and it could get really, really complicated if I try and plan it down to the single plant. I'm just going to try and keep it simple and take it step by step. So this would be the area where I would be growing fruit trees in an orchard. So I'm going to start there. I'm going to start with the big trees that I want, and that's how I'm going to sort of make the decisions on what goes underneath it. So in terms of deciding what those big trees should be, you need to consider what you want. So there's no point in me growing things here that I don't want the harvest of. But also considering sort of what's going to grow well here. So I'm in northwest Wales, but I'm quite coastal, so it's windy. It's really, really windy, but it's not too cold. So we get sort of a light frost, like it is right now, hence why I've got my hot water bottle under my coat. But we don't really get that like heavy frost covered in snow thing, just because of how close to the sea we are. So that's kind of what I'm working with. It's got to be reasonably frost tolerant, and a bit of wind can't be the end of the world. So I'm pretty lucky here. There are loads of things that fall into the category of what I could grow here. But I'm just, bearing in mind it's not going to be tropical things because I don't live in a tropical place. So basically I'm going to have a look at, I've already ordered them, so I already know what these things are. Something else I considered when picking the trees is of how much work they're going to need, sort of the pruning requirements and the care requirements. I don't want to be coming out here for years every winter throwing fleece around trees and things like that. I know that people do, I just know that I won't. So I think for me, they do have to have a bit of frost tolerance. As I say, we don't get like a heavy, deep frost, but it does get below zero. So I know that I don't want to do too specialist pruning. I'm happy to do a prune, but anything that's too specialist is probably asking a bit too much of me at this stage. So relatively simple care needs. I also have to consider how each tree is pollinated. So some things are self-fertile and you need one. Some things require another tree of the same kind to pollinate them. So what I've done is try to sort of go with self-fertile things, like I've done a Victoria plum, for example, a good solid UK variety of plums. I'm pretty confident with that. We've had them before. And then I've gone with some different apples, but I've made sure that they're things that can cross-pollinate one another. I've also ordered some crab apples, so hopefully they will sort of, if there is a gap in the pollination crossover time, that will sort that problem. I've ordered a pear tree, a couple of apple trees, a cherry tree. I've also ordered, as I say, some crab apples, some hazel and some elder. Now, the hazel and the elder are a bit smaller. They're not going to be that big a canopy layer, but I'm just going off of my tree order. So those things are on the list and I need to find a place for them to go. So the next thing to do is choose some bushes. So I did this sort of alongside the tree choosing because I ordered them from the same places. It's hard to know like how many of things I'm going to want, because I've kind of got to weigh up between A, the upfront cost of buying these things in, B, the space of where I'm going to put them, and C, sort of the work to keep them alive at this early stage. So I figure I've gone quite basic to start with, and then there's nothing stopping us from growing and expanding into the space as time goes on, and as you start to realise, I'll learn lessons once these things go in. I'll learn lessons from this land, and we can change things and add to it and just see how we go. So in terms of soft fruit, I've ordered about 15 raspberry canes, some blueberry bushes and some currant bushes. So we'll just pop those in when they arrive and I will see how that goes. As I say, it is the two of us. I am looking to do a lot of preserving and things of my fruit and gifting and all sorts of fun things, but it is only me, so there is no point in me growing like tons and tons and tons of the same thing if we're not going to use it. My neighbour has very kindly offered me some of his strawberry runners and some rhubarb crowns, which is grand because he's my next door neighbour, so I know that if they've done well here for him, chances are I'll be able to keep them alive, and then that's something else I don't have to source. So side note, anytime anyone local offers me anything for the garden, and I gladly take it, because I'm getting advice from people who already have grown that thing. They've grown it here, so we know that it goes well, and hey, it gets me chatting to people who have similar interests to me. So talk to people about your gardens, because it's a winner for everybody. You might get some free stuff. So before getting too far into sort of the planning of every little thing, every little perennial thing I want to grow here, I think this is a good time for me to stop and think about what the things I've already ordered are going to need in order to increase their chance of being successful. The beauty of doing something like this, a permaculture system, is that you can keep it kind of a closed system. You don't need to be bringing loads and loads of things in, i.e. I don't need to be buying lots of compost and fertilizers and mulch and things from outside every year to get things to keep things happy. So all of our fields here are completely covered in grass at the moment, so while I have dug out some holes for the trees, inevitably that grass is going to fill back in over time, and then is eventually going to be competing for water and nutrients with my young trees. So I could be bringing in something external. I could buy in wood chips or something to try and sort of mulch around the base of the trees and keep the grass back, or I could look for something that I can plant that's going to sort of do that job for me. So the idea of creating a sort of rhizome barrier to the grass, planting something around the base of the tree to stop the grass from encroaching over, is a cool idea. So I've read about people doing like garlic chives and wild garlic and things like that under the base of the tree, because they like that shady condition, but it also stops your perennial grasses and things from coming straight in or filling that space under the tree and therefore competing with it. And that's especially cool if that thing is then something that I get a harvest out of itself. I also hear people talking a lot about nitrogen fixing plants, and this is the perfect use for this kind of thing. So things like yarrow and comfrey are great nitrogen fixers, and I do plan to dot them around a lot of my sort of nitrogen heavy feeding plants, because that way don't need to be bringing in sort of a specific fertilizer. I'm using something that I'm already growing in that space, and a lot of those things have another use. I can just cut and drop those things and leave them to compost in place. And then things like yarrow, I have other sort of herbal uses for, so it's a win-win. And anything that I plant on purpose is going to compete with the grass that I've got here. So I do want to start sort of trying to outcompete the grass in these spaces rather than having to try to find a way to keep it back. I'd rather have it competing with something that I want to be there instead. Otherwise it's a lot of sort of manual labour trying to keep grass back. I'm very much going to treat this as sort of an ongoing experiment. I'll try some stuff and some things will work and some things won't, but we'll just learn from it and keep going. There are plenty of other things, perennial things I want to get started for the agroforestry area, but I am having to sort of consider the best places to spend my money at the moment, because I've got a couple of acres all together that are going to be planted up in the spring next year between the permaculture agroforestry area and my annual veggie garden, and I can't be buying sort of established trees and bushes for all of those things. So I am going to try and start as many things as I can from seed, because even the things start from seed, even if I don't get harvest in the first year or 2 or 3, well, they're still going to come in before the fruit trees do probably. So I do just have to accept that this is a long-term project that I'm working towards, and there is no point in me having like big things that get established before the trees do, because then once the trees grow and shade everything out, everything will change. So things are going to change and develop, and I do want to use the space around the trees in the meantime, but I do have to consider the impact that the trees as they grow are going to have on all these things I'm putting in the meantime. So I have some sort of perennial veggies and herbs and things like that I'm going to plant in this area and see how they go. I know a lot of those things prefer a lot more sun than is going to be available under an established tree, but as I say, it's going to be a while before those trees are established. You know, not every area is going to be like directly under the heavy shade of a tree, so try and use like all the space as we go, and obviously that is going to change and evolve, but that's okay. I'll use the opportunity while the trees are getting established to see what else works here, learn how to grow certain things. I've not really... robins. I've not really done sort of too much perennial gardening because we move so much, so my garden is always an annual one. So this is a nice opportunity for me to sort of get started with some perennial things. I really want to try sort of perennial onions and leeks, walking onions and things like that. So I'm going to experiment with all of that in that space, and as I say, some things will work and some things won't, but I'll just learn from it and see how we go. In terms of actually deciding what else I'm going to put in here around my trees and bushes, I have a big list of things. I basically spent like a full day going through seed seed sellers websites, and finding all the things in the world. I've also used a lot of other people's resources that are out there to give me like loads of ideas, and then it's worth looking at each of those things and looking at how well that's going to potentially interact with something else that's going in, and how I can fit it in around the other things. As I say, it's not all just going to work out perfectly straight away, but that's my thought process, is that everything that I think might be useful that I want, what might that need to help it be successful, and how can it potentially help something else be successful. I love the idea of guilds. If you've watched YouTube videos on like fruit tree guilds, the idea that you sort of, rather than trying to look at it as one whole forest that has to interact, which is just a bit too much and too big, is that you can sort of really break it down into groups of like 3 or 4 plants and how they're going to interact, and then plant those things together and then have multiple guilds in an area to build up your forest. I love the idea of that. That's such a much simpler way for my brain to accept in terms of getting started. At the moment it's just a big field of grass, and I'm hopeful that once there are some things in there and you start to see the interactions, then next steps might become a bit more obvious. Whereas at the moment, I think the way I'm going to go about it is sort of building a few different guilds based on the trees and the soft fruit bushes that I've already ordered, and then go from there. And the space will sort of fill in over time and new ideas will come to me. And we'll work it out that way. So where I'm at the moment, I've ordered trees. They say they'll get delivered some point between November and February. It's mid-December now, and I don't have any trees, so I'm just waiting to see what happens when they arrive, and then we'll go from there. But as I say, a lot of things are going to be starting from seed, so that's not going to happen till the spring anyway, so there's no rush. I just wanted to get everything ready so that when the trees and stuff do come in, I'm ready to go and I don't freak out and waste my trees. Hey guys, so I filmed that food forest intro chit chat back in December of 22, and I've just started putting it together and realised that I didn't really finish it, so I thought I would just hop back on and round it up. I didn't know if I was going to end up sharing this one because it was such early days and I didn't know how relevant all of that information was going to be, but on reflection I think it's really cool to sort of see where it started, where my head was at the start, and how much things have changed. So I figure I'll put it together and put it on the channel and you can watch it if you want to. So much has changed and progressed in the few months since I first filmed that, and all of those videos are going to be on the channel very shortly, so you can hop over there and see the progress that we've already made. So if you do want to see me actually do some of this stuff that I've blabbed on about in this video, then head over to the channel, and all the videos will be there and I'll keep showing you the progress as we go and as we develop this food forest. Cheers guys, till next time.